All right guys, here it is. Mini walking foot versus full-size industrial walking foot compared. Take two. This is my second video on this topic. This time we're looking at the Sailrite Stitchmaster versus the Juki 1541. Now in my original comparison video, I looked at a Sailrite LSZ1. Now that's their zigzag model of mini walking foot. And I pitted that against a Juki LU-563. So if you want to see how that comparison came out, I'll link up to it in the description. Let's start with the Sailrite. Now this one is branded as the Stitchmaster, but what you have to realize with these Sailrite portable walking foot machines is that whether it's called an LS or a Stitchmaster or the Leatherwork, they're all the same head. I mean identical, other than the color and the little badge on the front. Now if it's a Stitchmaster or a Leatherwork, that means it's probably in a package that comes on a small table with a speed reducer and separate servo. So those are the only differences, but the actual machine head itself, identical. This one is a straight stitch walking foot machine. It has reverse, but no zigzag. If you're looking for the model with zigzag, you need the LSZ models. It comes with a tiny little table, so we'll check that out and look at some of the features. I mean, just look at the size of that thing. Yes, it has some of the same features as an industrial table, but it's just incredibly small. It's so small, in fact, that when I had my Sailrite Leatherwork, I was motivated to add a flip-up extension table, and that may be worth doing, so I'll link to that video if that's a project you're interested in. Somewhat unique to the Sailrite machines are these cogged belts, and I like them. I think they're a win. They work quite well. And for these packages that have the small speed reducer, you actually have two belts. One that goes from the hand wheel of the machine down to the speed reducer, and a second that connects the speed reducer to the servo motor. And I'll just tip the head back to get that belt in place. There we go. And there it is. It's branded as Sailrite, but it also says Craft Tool Pro Stitchmaster. Some of these were part of a retail partnership with Tandy Leather, so you may have found the machine there or just at Sailrite online. Now when I say speed reducer, don't get too excited. It's nowhere near the size or durability of a full industrial speed reducer. This one will give you about a 2-to-1 reduction, but it does have it and it's included with the machine, so overall I guess it's a benefit. Honestly, my first impression on the speed reducer is it looks more like a hardware store bracket than something purpose-built for an industrial sewing machine. But this package does come with the workhorse servo, and that's always been a real bright spot in the Sailrite lineup. In fact, the only thing I don't like about this motor is you have to reach all the way underneath to turn it on. These Sailrite machines always sound kind of angry to me when you run them, especially if it's at a higher speed. This machine is freshly oiled and it doesn't really change how the machine sounds. They always kind of sound like this. Plastic hand wheel, of course, on this machine. They do have metal monster wheels available. I don't know if it's a big advantage to you. It might feel better in the hand, but otherwise, plastic is what it comes with. Now the bobbin's a little bit smaller on the Sailrite machines, but you're going to be sewing with lighter thread too. Usually a 69 weight or a 92 weight thread, so that seems to make pretty good sense for a smaller machine like this. And I was very curious to see whether the noise from this machine was from the head itself or from that workhorse servo, so I popped off one of the drive belts and let's just see. Yeah, so very quiet spinning the workhorse servo. The mechanical noise you hear is just from the head itself. So spin the wheel towards you to pick up the lower thread, and there's two cardinal rules for industrial sewing machines. Only turn the hand wheel towards you and never force the machine. So if you hit a hard obstruction, look for the source of that and see if you can remedy it. Let's try it on some wax canvas. This is actually Sailrite wax canvas in brown, and let's see if we can balance out our tension on this. Always drop your presser foot, and look how slowly we can sew with that workhorse servo and speed reducer. I mean, that's a real advantage if you like to do detailed work. Of course, you can hum along a little bit too. I do really notice that noise, but that's just what you get with the portable walking foot machine. Let's take a look at the action on this now. The needle is down and then the needle comes up, and now the material advances. And so that makes this a double feed type of walking foot machine. In other words, you don't have needle feed with this. You've got your feed dogs from below and your alternating presser feet working together to move the material forward. But you don't have needle feed. The needle stays up as it's advanced, and that's one key difference between this and the Juki that we'll look at a little bit later. Now with the Sailrite, you get this somewhat odd foot lift on top of the machine that is a little more convenient than the ones on the back of the machine that you might see on a domestic, but nowhere near as convenient as a knee lift that you'd have on the typical industrial. So with the needle buried, I'll come around the corner, drop my presser foot again, and we'll see if we can balance out the tensions. I like the ability to sew that slowly. That's something you definitely couldn't do with a big clutch style motor. Let's hit the reverse and we'll try a little back tack. So the back tack looks good, and that's actually plunked down into the same holes in forward and reverse, but only because we carefully set that, and that's one limitation of the reverse system on this machine. More on that in a minute. But the tension looks good, nice on the top side, and it's pulling up the stitch nicely and pulling the knot to the middle of the material. That's hard to do with just 2 layers of this thin wax canvas, but looks good. All right, let's sew some leather and see how this Stitch Master does with that. After all, I have used my Leatherwork for some small upholstery projects. I particularly would use that one if it only had 2 layers of medium weight leather. So let's test it out though into some piping applications and sewing typical upholstery seams and see how well it does, and then we'll repeat those same tests with the bigger Juki. And I just noticed my leather swatch is left over from this project that I upholstered a while back, and these are the sorts of projects you can tackle if you have a machine that can handle leather. The first test will just be 2 layers of this 2.5 to 3 ounce leather. It's a soft leather for upholstery. Hold your threads back a little bit and back tack if you like. As far as punching power, no problem at all going through this soft leather. Now the problem I came up against in the past was clearance under the presser foot on my Leatherwork. So far so good, but again, we're just sewing 2 layers. We'll sew some piping in a minute and see how it does with that. Looks like we're balancing a nice stitch, so we'll carry on. As far as controlling the speed and direction of this machine, I think it's very easy to do, and even a beginner would have no trouble. If you're stepping up from a home machine, I think this will seem like a real upgrade for leather projects. The tension looks good on the top and on the bottom. Sometimes when you switch to heavier leather material, you'll have to increase your tension a bit, but so far it looks good. I don't know if I'll ever get used to that presser foot lift, but I'll give it a try. The Stitch Master has that posi pin, so you can pull that out if you want to quickly wind a bobbin. This may make it better than previous portables like the Thompson machine, but I tell you what, this is not a huge benefit for me, and it certainly doesn't compare to the large heavy-duty hand wheels on a full industrial. So despite only being a double feed walking foot, it really has no trouble advancing the material. I'm definitely not having to pull it through the machine, it just advances it automatically. The reverse lever on the Sailrites is really basic. They have tried making some improvements over the years, but really the limitation of the system is you have to adjust both the reverse and the forward stitch length, and you have to kind of time those together each time you make an adjustment to your stitch length. Now that's only important if you want the reverse to exactly match the forward stitch length like I do, because I do a lot of leather work. So if that's not important to you, it will still lock in a perfect stitch if these are slightly off. But if that matters to you and you do a lot of top stitching or leather work, this is a real pain, because this is an adjustment you have to do several times on a project where it's just automatic on a big industrial. At least they have little markings on the face of the machine to give you somewhat of a gauge as to how to set those. All right, let's try some piping in leather. This is a 5/32 cording, so the machine already has on it a shallow piping foot, so we'll give that a try. And a big part of upholstery is just getting your work situated, and I think that makes it a little bit more difficult if you don't have a knee lift, because you almost have to have 3 hands. But I'm also noticing the lack of foot lift here. I can barely get that piping under my presser foot. There are adjustments on this machine, but honestly they do very little to increase the clearance under your foot. And again, as far as punching power with that workhorse servo, no trouble, it just goes through it effortlessly. So I just look at how easy it is to control, and if this would work for me doing some upholstery projects. Maybe that's just making cushions or home deck projects, or maybe you have a little bit larger ambitions as far as outdoor cushions or doing some upholstery, and we'll see if this would work. Yeah, seems to be feeding through just fine. I'm definitely not having to pull it through manually, so that's good. And usually I don't even bother back tacking on my piping. There we go. So now 2 layers of this 2.5 to 3 ounce leather with piping in between, so overall thickness is 4 layers. And we'll see if we can even fit this under the presser foot, let alone sew. All right, I have my doubts if it'll handle this, but we'll give it a whirl. Had some shortened stitches there at the beginning because it's just dragging. There, finally caught. Yeah, and the feeding doesn't feel free or easy on this, and it's just because the walking feet don't lift up high enough for this type of project. Might be fine for piping with a lighter duty home upholstery, home deck type fabric, but even though this is soft leather, it has a thickness to it. This really feels like one of those things that you could get away with doing for small projects, but it doesn't make it easy, I'll tell you that much. Still no trouble on the punching power, so that's good. Oh. So we started out okay. At least it did make a functional seam where it stitched it together. I can see some blue stitching in there, so it's not a nice pretty seam though. And then as we went, we did develop a problem with some puckering and bunching, and that's just a typical problem you'll see if you try to do these heavy-duty sorts of projects with a small portable machine. Hey, if you like today's topic, give me a quick thumbs up, and if you're not already, consider becoming a subscriber. And as far as questions, ask them if you got them. I always enjoy chatting down in the comment section. The Juki is a nice package on rolling casters, and full model number on this one is a DNU-1541S. And the S on the model number just stands for safety clutch. And then we'll repeat all those tests on the Juki. Overall, this is a large bobbin machine. It uses an M-style bobbin, and it's a side loader underneath, just like the Sailrite. So some interesting similarities, but I know the criticism I'll get. Somebody will say, well, it's like you're comparing a light missile cruiser to a battleship. They're just not in the same class. That's absolutely correct. And I want to compare them because they're close enough in price that people might assume if one can do it, the other machine can handle it as well. And we'll see. Okay, with the wax canvas, we'll see how the Juki does. Triple feed walking foot in this case, so as the needle is down, then the material advances, so that's generally preferred over a double feed walking foot, but as long as you have the walking foot, that's the main thing, but triple feed is considered a better feeding mechanism. The blue stitching will be from the Sailrite, and kind of this lemon yellow color will be from the Juki, so we'll be able to tell them apart. But it looks like I've got a little too much upper tension for this light canvas, so I'll just back that off a bit. Maybe a closer look at that triple feed in case there's any questions on that, but needle is down, then the material advances, and then the needle comes up, so you have feed dogs below, needle feed, and alternating presser feet above. And that's really an excellent feeding system. This machine does have a digital servo motor, but no needle position sensor, so you have to kind of manually stop at the right spot if you want to do a 90-degree corner. Pretty good for speed control, maybe not as slow as I would like for, you know, leather crafting, making credit card holders or wallets, something like that, but that is really just related to the motor and not the machine head, so it just depends whether you have a speed reducer or a servo that can sew nice and slow on its own. That makes all the difference for how your machine behaves. Paddle style reverse, and that will fall right back into the same stitching hole, and that's independent of stitch length. So this system really seems like a standard across industrials. Many industrials are that way. You don't have to adjust anything like you would on the Sailrite to get the forward and reverse stitch length to be the same length each time. I'm anticipating I'll probably have to tweak my upper tension a little bit to sew leather here, so let's try that out on this machine and see how it does. This is really something in its wheelhouse. It's made for sewing leather and upholstery weight fabrics up to about 3/8 of an inch or maybe 7/16 of an inch thick, and does quite well. So I'll bury that needle and come around the corner, and then we'll take a look at our tension. So it looks good on the top side, and looks like we're pulling up a nice even stitch on the bottom, so tension looks good. There's easy adjustments you can make around the back of the machine to control the height of the steppage on the feet, and that actually makes a big difference in how the machine operates. I usually set mine to somewhere in the middle, and that works for most of my projects. This 1541 is actually my second favorite Juki in the upholstery class of machines, second only to the 1508. Now on this, what I really love about it is by hand you get a modest 9mm presser foot lift, but if you want to lift by knee, you get an incredible 16mm lift, and that makes it so much easier to get your workpiece onto the machine. And the knee lift system on these modern Jukis is really world class. Just remember, you have to pull the knee lift off from the front before you can tip your machine back, but luckily that pulls off and reinstalls without any tools. This is a standard foot on my machine, so I'll have to swap that out for a 1/4 inch piping foot to finish up the rest of the tests. Besides, this one has that silly brush guard on it that I can't stand. Usually easiest if you put the center foot on first and finish up with the outer foot. Okay, we've got the same piping, and we'll try that on this machine. Holding the threads back to get going. This one has a little more space under that 1/4 inch piping foot. I'm not sure if there's a larger cording foot available from Sailrite, but I feel like that may have helped me to a certain extent if I was just wanting to do piping on that machine, but this one just chomps through it, no problem. And now for the regular piping seam. There's a lot of industrials that don't give you that much presser foot lift, and it's really appreciated when you start to get a little bulk to your project. So we'll hold the threads back and see how this one does. The suede side of this leather is giving me a little bit of a problem, but could have been part of the issue with the Sailrite. Let's see how it looks when we pull it out of the machine. Okay, some improvements there. Looks like a nice functional seam, good and strong. Although I can see some bright colored thread along the piping in certain areas, and that's one reason that I tend to use a zipper foot for the initial pass of closing up the piping, and only switch to a 1/4 inch cording foot once I'm ready to sew up the seam, and that just makes any of the thread along the cording invisible. This one uses a Gold Star servo. I don't know if it's quite slow enough to do my typical leather working. For that, usually I would use a speed reducer or my special Kinedyne servo motor, but let's try it out. Looks like it's got enough power at least. And I really like that high lift because you can gauge how you're doing as you get close to that corner. and see where you want your needle to land. It makes it really easy. And wow, that is just as ugly as you'd imagine with the yellow thread, but you can also see how a machine like this could be really handy for doing your leather craft. I think we'll just staple that so it doesn't shift on us while we sew. It's actually a common trick of leather upholstery folks to actually staple the pieces together. And of course you remove those before you stuff your cushion. This is just a long nose plier stapler. It's a Boss Stitch model P3. Works really good. And if you do take the time to staple things up before you get started, boy, you can really sew carefree, knowing that nothing will shift on you as you make your way down the line. Yeah, that is looking absolutely great. That 1/4 inch piping foot just kind of follows the cording like a train on the tracks and looks good. Little back tack and you got it. So that's a seam you could be proud about. It's nice and tight, good functional seam, but I don't see any threads coming through, no puckering or anything uneven about it. So that's exactly what you'd want in a furniture cushion. Then I'll actually staple this little sample seam together just so that nothing can shift while we sew. Well, the problem remains, there's just not quite enough clearance under the presser feet for this to be easy, but we'll give it a shot. So good power, good control. I just often wish there was a little more lift to those presser feet. Yay, I finally got a normal looking seam with the Sailrite. No visible stitches along the cording there. Everything looks strong and professional. So I would say if you're using leather and you're struggling with limited clearance under the presser feet, that stapling up your parts first is really going to be a key point. And of course you want to remove those staples before it goes into a finished cushion or project. The Juki is due for oiling, so let me pull off this top cover and I'll show you some of the systems a machine like this has to keep it well lubricated over time. There's a main upper reservoir here. You actually fill that with oil, and then several different felt pads and wicks throughout the machine. That basically it's a semi-automatic lubrication system, so the machine is supposed to do a lot of this for you, but it doesn't hurt to occasionally saturate those wicks, and of course you'll use nothing but just clear sewing machine oil. And there's another big oil reservoir down underneath the machine. You want to make sure that that stays between the low and the high mark on the glass there, and to refill that with sewing machine oil, you just use this port here. I've done a detailed video on how to oil this 1541. If you're interested in that, I'll throw it down in the description box for you. And you've got your safety clutch here. Now that does a great job to prevent damage to the hook should you jam your machine up. And this machine is never really noisy, but it really quiets down once you oil it. Now the Sailrite offers access to some oiling points through the top as well. Just remove the 2 screws here, and you can get a look at the inside of the machine. Sailrite's manual does a good job of explaining all the oiling points. This one was just oiled, but that's kind of what it looks like inside. There's no automatic lubrication system or anything. You just have to hit the points manually. And this plain lacquered MDF top I think leaves a little bit to be desired. It does have some nice bobbin storage area, but Basically, I tend to prefer a typical laminated top that would come with your average industrial machine. So let's do a quick recap on the pros and cons of the Sailrite Stitchmaster. I think that separate workhorse servo really gives you some extra power, and with that small 2-to-1 speed reducer, you also get good control. The overall table package is small, lightweight, and still pretty portable, so that may be the difference for you in being able to store something like this and have it set up for day-to-day sewing in your home. As far as the cons of this machine, I'm not really wild about the plastic hand wheel, but it's one thing I can live with. But probably the two most bothersome traits of this machine are the noise that it makes. It just kind of growls, it sounds angry. It's fine if that's all you know. I think you'll be happy with it, but if you compare it to a really smooth running industrial, the noise is noticeable. It's always there for me. And finally, the presser feet just don't lift high enough for my liking for the type of projects I do, and so that is a limiting factor for sure. So just to quantify that, I'm not able to get a 1/4 inch setup block under the presser feet. About maximum that will fit is 7/32 versus a 3/4 inch setup block with room to spare under the Juki. Of course, that doesn't mean it can sew that thick, but I have tested it in medium temper oil tanned leather up to about 1/2 inch thickness, and it does great with that. But I would say this machine has a higher foot lift than other industrials on the market as well, and it shares that same feature with the 1508, and that's probably the main reason why I own those two machines. So the 1541 is a really good sewing machine, and honestly this checks a lot of boxes for me. The only thing I would prefer is perhaps a top loading bobbin like my 1508, but maybe that's just a matter of preference. But otherwise, the large hand wheel and extra high presser foot lift really set this one apart. Plus you get some nice features like the semi-automatic lubrication and that safety clutch. If you're looking to add the 1541 to your stable of sewing machines, I'll put a link down in the description. And just the head on this big Juki weighs in at over 88 pounds. And when you lift it, it makes sounds like, ugh. And when you lift the Sailrite, you make noises like, oh, that's not so bad, because it weighs in just over 30 pounds. It's also a little less expensive, but at $1,500 in the table with speed reducer, it's definitely not cheap, so you'll have to factor that into the big picture when choosing your best machine. So if you're trying to decide between a portable walking foot machine, whether that's just on a tabletop version or it has a mini table versus a full-size industrial, hopefully some of the topics here have helped you narrow your choice and make it clear which one might be best for you.